The Atelier Musicale wasn't a concert hall. It was a living room. But a living room that seemed to suck the sound right out of your shoes. Everything in it was heavy and old and expensive. Dark velvet curtains swallowed the evening light from the tall windows. Gilt-framed portraits of serious-looking men in wigs seemed to watch the crowd with a kind of dusty disapproval. The air itself smelled of furniture polish, old paper, and a faint, sweet trace of the lilies arranged in a huge vase on the grand piano. It was the kind of place where you whispered, even if nothing was happening yet. People filtered in, not like a crowd coming to a show, but like guests arriving for a very important, slightly dull, meeting. The women wore dresses that whispered when they moved. The men had jackets that fit just so. Their voices were a low hum of polite conversation, talk of summer houses, of a recent gallery opening, of the disappointing state of the orchestra's second violins. In a corner, slightly away from the main cluster of chairs, sat a woman. She seemed to be trying to make herself even smaller than she was. Her name was Alara. She was there with her employer, a woman named Frau Heger, who was a significant patron of the arts. Frau Heger was across the room, holding court, her laugh a bright, confident peal that cut through the murmur. Alara was not holding court. She was sitting in a plush armchair that threatened to envelop her. Her dress was a simple, navy blue thing, well kept but from a style several seasons past. It was the kind of dress meant not to be seen. Her hands, pale and marked with the faint lines and small scars of a life lived doing practical things, were folded neatly in her lap. One thumb rubbed slowly, unconsciously, over a knuckle on the other hand, as if polishing a spot only she could see. She watched the room, but her eyes didn't dart about. They were calm, observant. She saw the young pianist, a boy of maybe 17, pacing near the doorway, his fingers twitching at his sides as he mentally ran through his piece. She saw the proud, tight smile of his mother, adjusting his bow tie for the third time. She saw the critical gaze of an older man, with a neatly trimmed white beard, the celebrated Maestro Rieger. He was the reason many were here, a composer and pianist of international fame. His presence was like a magnet. People angled their chairs toward him, hoping for a glance, a nod. Ilara's gaze lingered on the piano. It was a beautiful, monstrous thing, a black lacquer beast with its lid propped open like a giant, waiting wing. The light from a crystal sconce glinted off its polished surface. For a moment, her face lost its careful, neutral expression. Something flickered there, a deep, quiet familiarity, mixed with a touch of something like sorrow. Then she blinked, and it was gone, replaced by the modest, attentive look of a companion. A young woman in a sparkling silver dress took a seat near her, offering a polite, vacant smile. Alara returned it with a small one of her own. "Are you a friend of the family?" the young woman asked, making conversation. "Oh, no," Alara said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "I am here with Frau Heger." "Ah," the young woman said, the single syllable implying she had placed Alara neatly into a category: staff, helper, an accessory. Her interest faded instantly. She turned to her companion and began discussing the dreadful traffic on the Ringstrasse. Alara didn't seem offended. She simply went back to watching, to listening. She heard the fragments of musical talk around her. His technique is impeccable, of course. But the soul, where is the soul? A man muttered. She plays the list with tremendous fire, but I find it a bit untamed, a woman replied. Maestro Rieger's voice, deep and carrying the weight of authority, cut through. Virtuosity without structure is noise. The notes are not a river to drown in. They are stones to build with. People around him nodded thoughtfully, as if he'd just revealed a great truth. The recital began. The host, a slender man with impeccable manners, clinked a spoon against a glass. The room fell into that reverent, expectant silence unique to classical music events. One by one, the performers took their turn at the great black piano. First was the nervous boy. He played a Chopin etude. His fingers were indeed impeccable, flying across the keys with dizzying speed, but his face was a mask of concentration, his body rigid with fear. When he finished, the applause was warm, encouraging. His mother's eyes shone with relief. Maestro Rieger gave a single, slow nod, which the boy received like a blessing. Next was a young woman who played a piece by Schumann. It was more musical, more felt. She closed her eyes in the quieter passages. The audience leaned in, appreciative. Alara watched, her head tilted slightly. Her thumb had stopped its polishing. Her hands remained still. Between performances, the murmurs would start again. The evaluation. It was a social event as much as a musical one. People weren't just listening to the music. They were watching each other listen, signaling their own sophistication with knowing smiles or slight frowns. Frau Heger swept over during a break, her perfume arriving before she did. "My dear, are you quite all right? Not too bored?" she asked Ilara, her tone kind but distracted, her eyes already scanning the room to see who was talking to the maestro. "Not at all," Ilara said. "They are very talented. The usual parade," Frau Heger said with a wave of her hand. "But one must support the young artists, mustn't one?" She leaned in a little closer. "The maestro looks bored. He's heard it all before, 1,000 times over." She then drifted away to air kiss a new rival. Ilara's eyes went back to Maestro Rieger. He did look bored. He listened with a professional politeness, but his eyes, those sharp, intelligent eyes, were distant. He would hear a mistake no one else seemed to catch, a rushed tempo, a muddy pedal, and a faint, almost imperceptible tightening would appear at the corner of his mouth. He was like a chef tasting bland food. He was waiting for a flavor he couldn't find. The performances continued. A brave soul attempted a modern, dissonant piece that left some of the audience confused, but politely clapping. Another played a sweet, simple Mozart sonatina perfectly. Through it all, Ilara sat. She was so still, so separate from the performance and the social dance around it, that she began to feel invisible. Waiters offering glasses of champagne would sometimes pass her by, without noticing her outstretched hand, only to circle back with an apologetic look. Conversations would flow round her as if she were a stone in a stream. She didn't mind. There was a safety in it. In this room full of people performing music, performing taste, performing importance, her only job was to not be seen. And she was very good at it. She watched the hands of the pianists. Young hands, strong hands, carefully manicured hands. She looked down at her own. They were not a pianist's hands, not anymore. They were wider, capable. A small scar across the back of one from a baking dish long ago. A callus on a thumb from holding a pencil. These were hands that had chopped vegetables, mended linens, turned the pages of books for a frail parent. They were hands that had, for countless hours in another lifetime, danced over keys very different from this grand one. But that was a private memory, folded away like an old letter in a drawer. As the final scheduled performer, a young man with great flourish, launched into a showy rendition of a Rachmaninoff prelude, Ilara allowed herself one more long look at the piano. For a second, her fingers, resting on her knee, twitched. They curved just slightly, as if resting on an invisible key. Then the young man hit a thunderous chord, and she flinched, almost imperceptibly, not at the sound, but at the force of it, at the sheer drama. She settled back into her chair, her face once again a placid, modest mask, the quiet companion, the overlooked woman in the simple blue dress, waiting for the evening to be over so she could go home. The final, thunderous chord of the Rachmaninoff echoed in the high-ceilinged room, then was swallowed by the thick curtains and the eager applause that followed it. The young man at the piano, his hair slightly damp with effort, stood up and gave a deep, theatrical bow. The audience clapped with real warmth. It had been a flashy, exciting finish, the kind that left people feeling they had witnessed something difficult and impressive. The host, the slender man with the kind eyes, stepped forward again, a smile on his face. Thank you. What a magnificent way to conclude our evening," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. The clapping began to die down. People shifted in their seats, a few already glancing toward the doorway where the waiters stood with fresh trays of drinks. The social part of the evening, the part many were truly here for, was about to begin. It was in this moment of transition, as the formal program was clearly over, that Frau Heger moved. She had been sitting near Maestro Rieger, and now she leaned toward him, placing a hand lightly on his sleeve. She spoke, and though her voice was not loud, it carried in the low. "Maestro, a thought occurs. Our musical feast tonight need not be quite over." The maestro, who had been preparing to stand, paused. He looked at her, one white eyebrow raised slightly. He was a man who received many suggestions, most of them tiresome. "My dear companion," Frau Heger continued, gesturing across the room with her other hand, "has a great love for the piano. She is quite devoted to it. I wonder if we might impose upon her to share a little piece with us, a final, informal tribute to the evening." All eyes, following her gesture, landed on the woman in the navy blue dress. Ilara seemed to shrink instantly into the fabric of her chair. The modest, attentive expression she had worn all night froze, then shattered into one of pure, unguarded alarm. Her eyes, wide, darted from Frau Heger's smiling face to the host's suddenly uncertain one, and finally to the imposing figure of the maestro. A ripple of confusion went through the room. Who the quiet woman? The companion? Polite murmurs started up again, but this time the tone was different. It was laced with curiosity and a hint of discomfort. This was not part of the script. The host cleared his throat, his smile becoming strained. Oh, well, Frau Heger, I'm sure our guest is quite, that is, the program was rather full. He was trying to be kind, trying to spare this plainly uncomfortable woman from an embarrassing situation. But Frau Heger was not to be deterred. Her kindness, in this moment, had a stubborn, almost mischievous edge. Nonsense, the piano sits idle, and we are among friends, are we not? It would be a charming, personal note to end on. She turned her bright, insistent gaze back to the maestro. Maestro, would you not enjoy a little digestive for the ears? The power in the room rested with Maestro Rieger. Everyone watched him. He looked from Frau Heger's determined smile to Alara's pale, stricken face. He saw a modest, older woman, clearly out of her depth. He saw a social inconvenience. In his world, talented people fought for his attention. They did not need to be coaxed from corners. He gave a small, almost imperceptible sigh, the sigh of a man asked to perform one more tedious duty. He offered a thin, polite smile. But of course, he said, his deep voice neutral, the more music, the better. It was the gracious thing for a guest of honor to say. It was also a dismissal. He did not say, I would be delighted to hear her. He simply acquiesced, signaling that this would be a minor, perhaps awkward, interlude before the real conversation could begin. His words were permission. The host, seeing the maestro's lack of objection, had no choice. He forced his smile wider and turned to the audience. Well, a delightful surprise. Let us welcome. He realized he did not know her name. Alara, Frau Heger supplied, beaming. Let us welcome Alara, the host said, gesturing toward the piano. The applause that came was hesitant, scattered. It was the sound of people clapping not in anticipation, but out of social obligation, mixed with a dose of pity. No one likes to watch a train wreck, but no one wants to be seen as unkind either. They were all trapped in the same polite nightmare. For Alara, the world had narrowed to a tunnel. The faces around her were a blur of pink and beige, their eyes like soft, pressing weights. Her heart was a frantic bird in her chest. This was her worst fear, realized not in a nightmare, but in this elegant, stifling room. She wanted to shake her head, to mouth no to Frau Heger, to flee, but a lifetime of not making a scene, of being good, of following the wishes of others, held her rooted to the spot. She felt, rather than saw, the expectant stillness settle over the room. It was a different silence than before. Before, it had been reverent. Now, it was thick with awkwardness, waiting to be broken slowly, as if her joints had rusted. She pushed herself up from the armchair. The simple blue dress, which had been a shield of invisibility, now felt like a costume announcing her as an imposter. She could feel the gaze of the young man who had just played the Rachmaninoff. It held not rivalry, but a kind of professional sympathy. She saw the former violinist in the back row looking down at her hands, as if to spare her. The walk to the piano was the longest of her life. Each step on the polished wood floor echoed. She was aware of the rustle of her dress, the too loud sound of her own breathing. She did not look at the maestro, but she could feel his gaze on her. It was not unkind, just detached, analytical. He was already listening, waiting for the first mistake. She reached the piano. The black lacquer surface, so beautiful from a distance, now loomed over her, reflecting a distorted, tiny version of the room and her own frightened face. The keys, ivory and ebony, stretched out like a waiting challenge. This was not her piano. Her piano was an old, scarred upright in his sunroom at Frau Heger's country house, its tone mellow and forgiving. This instrument was a beast of concert halls, its voice powerful enough to fill this room and reveal every single flaw. For a moment, she just stood beside the bench, her hand resting on its cool, smooth wood. A wave of memory, sharp and sudden, hit her, not of performance, but of solitude, of playing for no one. As moonlight streamed through a window, of playing not to be heard, but to feel asterisk. That memory brought with it a fragment of calm. She pulled the bench out and sat down. It was too low. The host, trying to be helpful, rushed over. Allow me, he murmured, and began to turn the knob underneath to raise it. The metallic asterisk click dash click click asterisk was horribly loud in the quiet. He adjusted it too high, then too low, his own nervousness making him clumsy. Finally, He stepped back. It is fine, Elara whispered. Her voice so dry it was almost soundless. She was alone at the piano. The room held its breath. She placed her hands in her lap, looking at the keys. The calluses on her thumbs seemed to pulse. The small scar was a white line against her skin. These were not a young prodigy's hands. They were the hands of a woman who had lived a different life. What could she possibly play? The cheerful Mozart, the showy Chopin. Those belonged to the young people, to this world. To play them now would be an apology, an attempt to fit in where she did not belong. It would be a failure they all expected. So she did not choose a piece. She let a piece choose her. It came to her not as a title, but as a feeling, a deep, old ache, and a peace that lived right beside it. It was the music she played. When the house was silent and the weight of her own history felt too heavy, it was a conversation, not a performance. She took a slow, deep breath, shutting out the room. The faces, the pity, the expectation. She shut out the bored, waiting maestro. She thought not of the notes, but of the silence between them. She thought of the color of the sound she needed, not bright, not brilliant, but a deep, velvety gray, like the dusk outside. She lifted her hands. They no longer trembled. They moved with a slow, deliberate gravity that was utterly at odds with her timid walk to the bench. Her posture, which had been slumped with reluctance, straightened. Her shoulders dropped. She became, in that instant, centered, focused. Her fingers hovered for a second over the keys. Then she placed them down, not to strike, but to settle. The first chord she played was not a melody, but a foundation, a deep, resonant, profoundly sad note from the lower register of the piano, held with the pedal so it hummed in the air like a bell tolling far away. It was the first sound she had made in that room all night, and in an instant, everything changed. The sound was not what anyone expected. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't fast. It wasn't a tune you could hum. That first, deep note from the lower part of the piano wasn't a note you played at a party. It was a note you felt in your bones. It hung in the perfumed air of the salon like a shadow, dark and warm and full of something heavy. The audience, which had been holding its breath in a kind of polite dread, didn't exhale. They just paused. The feeling in the room shifted, almost like a physical change in the air pressure. The awkward pity, the low-grade discomfort. It all went still. Elara's hands, those wide, capable hands, moved. They didn't dance or fly. They pressed, they weighed, they shaped the sound. Another note joined the first, then another, building a slow, painful chord that seemed to speak of a loss too old for tears. This was the beginning of Beethoven's slow movement from his greatest, most difficult sonata piece musicians call the Hammerklavier. It is a mountain few pianists ever tried to climb in public. It is not music for showing off. It is music for surviving. She played the opening theme. It was a simple melody, really, just a slow walk down a scale. But in her hands, it was a lifetime. Each note had weight. There was a tiny space between them, a hesitation that wasn't unsure, but thoughtful. It was the sound of someone remembering something beautiful and broken. Maestro Rieger, who had been leaning back in his chair with an attitude of patient waiting, slowly came forward. He rested his elbows on his knees. The polite, detached look was gone from his face. It was replaced by pure, focused listening. His professional ear, which had been critiquing technique all night, shut off. Something deeper switched on. He wasn't hearing a performance now. He was hearing a story. He heard the control. The way her left hand held the deep, rumbling bass notes with a steady, anchor-like pressure. The way her right hand made the melody sing, not with a flashy vibrato, but with a touch so careful it made the piano sound like a human voice, cracking with age and feeling. This wasn't learned from a book. This was learned from living. In the audience, people forgot to look at each other. They forgot to think about what they would say later. The young man who had played the Rachmaninoff earlier sat perfectly still, his earlier confidence gone. He was hearing something he knew he couldn't play, not in 100 years of practice. It wasn't about the notes. It was about what was behind them. Elara herself was gone. The timid woman in the blue dress had vanished. In her place was a conduit for something vast and old. Her eyes were open, but they weren't seeing the piano or the room. They were fixed on some middle distance, watching the memories the music drew up. Her face, usually so carefully blank, was alive with a quiet intensity. There was sorrow in the lines around her mouth, but also a strange, hard-won peace in her brow. She wasn't playing asterisk for asterisk them. She was simply playing, and they were allowed to listen. The music built. It grew from that lonely lament into something stronger, more questioning. The chords became more complex, wrestling with each other. You could hear doubt in it, and anger, and a struggle for hope. Her body moved with it, not with theatrical swings, but with a natural, grounded motion. She leaned into the keyboard when the music demanded weight. She drew back, her hands lifting with a tender care. When the melody became fragile, Frau Heger watched. Her earlier mischievous smile softened into an expression of awe. She had known, of course. She had heard Alara play in the quiet sunroom of the country house, had seen the way the dust motes would dance in the afternoon light. As this same music filled the empty space, she had wanted to share it, to break her friend out of her shell. But even she had not expected this total transformation, this utter command of a room that had moments before looked down on her, a woman in the front row, a society lady who had spent the evening discussing the price of porcelain, found her vision blurring. The music was touching a place in her she had forgotten, a memory of her own father, long gone, who used to hum fragments of Beethoven while he worked. She didn't know the name of the piece, but she knew the feeling. It was recognition. Then came a series of trills, quick, shimmering notes high on the piano, like light trying to break through storm clouds. Alara's hands, which had seemed so strong and solid in the lower notes, became delicate, almost ethereal. The trills were perfect, even, but they weren't cold. They sounded like a fragile, trembling hope. Maestro Rieger's head tilted. A true, controlled trill was a mark of a master. This wasn't just control, it was expression. She made the lights sound desperate. The music fell back into the deep well of the opening theme. But it was changed now. It was the same melody, but heavier, as if carrying all the struggle that had come in between. This was the heart of it. This was where many players would pour on sentiment, would try to make it cry. Alara did the opposite. She played it simply, clearly, with a bare, devastating honesty. The notes were clean and separate, like stones placed on a grave. It was more powerful than any sob could have been. In the back, the former violinist was no longer looking at her hands. Tears were streaming down her face openly, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. She heard in this music the echo of her own lost career, the private grief for a voice she no longer shared with the world. This woman at the piano was playing for every person who had ever put a part of themselves away in a box, thinking it was no longer needed. Alara moved into a new section, a series of quiet, questioning chords that climbed upward, searching for a resolution that wouldn't come. The physical effort was clear now. A sheen of sweat was visible on her temple. Her breaths were timed with the phrases. This was not easy. It was a monumental effort of memory, of muscle, of emotion. But there was no strain in the sound, only a profound exhaustion that was part of the music itself. She was nearing the end of the movement. The music became a series of deep, resigned sighs, the harmonies resolving in a way that felt less like an answer and more like an acceptance. The final notes were a slow descent to soft chords, spaced apart by a silence so deep you could hear the faint hiss of the old building's heating pipes. Her hands played the last, lowest note. She held the pedal down, letting the sound vibrate through the body of the great piano and out into the room. Then, slowly, she lifted her fingers. She let her hands fall from the keys and rest in her lap. She bowed her head, her shoulders slumping just a little, as if she had just laid down a great weight she had been carrying for a very long time. The sound faded into absolute silence. It was a different silence than before. The awkwardness, the pity, the boredom, all of it had been scoured away by the music. What was left was a clean, stunned quiet. No one coughed. No one rustled a program. No one even seemed to breathe. They were all, in their own way, somewhere else, taken to a place of raw, unpolished truth by a woman they had not seen until this very moment. The melody was over, but it hadn't left them. It was stuck in the room, and in their chests. The modest woman at the piano had, with her first and only melody, rewritten the entire evening, and no one, least of all the great maestro, knew what to do next. The silence didn't break, it settled. It became a thing in the room, thick and real, like the velvet of the curtains. The final, fading hum of the piano string was gone, but the music seemed to have left a ghost behind, a shape in the air that everyone could still feel. No one moved to clap. It would have felt wrong, like shouting in a cathedral. The usual rustle of clothes, the polite clearing of a throat, none of that happened. People just sat, caught in the aftermath. The woman in the front row who remembered her father didn't reach for a handkerchief. She let the tears dry on her cheeks, her face soft and unguarded. The young pianist stared at the floor, his own flashy performance now feeling like a child's noise in his memory. All eyes were on the figure at the piano. Alara sat with her head bowed, her hands limp in her lap. She looked drained, empty. The focused energy that had held her upright was gone. She was just a woman again, in a simple dress, sitting at a very large piano. The transformation had been total, and now it was over. She seemed almost surprised to find herself there. The first person to move was Maestro Rieger. He did not applaud. He stood up. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic leap. It was a slow, almost weary unfolding, as if the weight of what he had heard was physical. The chair leg scraped softly on the polished floor, a shockingly ordinary sound in the profound quiet. He did not look at the audience. He did not smile a congratulatory smile. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, were fixed only on Alara. He took a step, then another, his footsteps measured and slow on the wooden floor. He walked toward the piano not as a maestro approaching a student, but as a pilgrim approaching a shrine. The entire room watched this journey of 10 feet. It felt like a mile. He stopped beside the great black instrument. He looked down at her, and his face was unlike any expression he had worn all evening. There was no trace of boredom, no polite interest, no critical analysis. His features were etched with something raw, a deep, reverent confusion. It was the look of a man who had discovered a masterpiece in his own attic, covered in dust. He spoke. His voice, usually so full of confident authority, was low and a little rough. "Madam." The single word hung in the air. It wasn't Miss, it wasn't her name. It was a title of respect, old-fashioned and formal, and he meant it completely. Alara slowly lifted her head. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and a little lost, as if she were waking from a deep sleep. She seemed to barely recognize where she was, or who was addressing her. He swallowed, searching for words. The man who gave lectures to packed halls, who criticized world-class orchestras, was struggling. "Where?" he began, then stopped. He tried again, his voice gaining a little strength, colored by sheer, undisguised wonder. "Where have you been?" It was not a question about the evening. It was a question about a lifetime. Asterisk, where have you been hiding this? Where has this voice been? While the rest of us made our noise. Asterisk. Alara opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She simply shook her head, a tiny, helpless motion. There was no answer she could give that would fit in that room. Her silence seemed to unlock the room. It was as if the maestro's movement, his broken question, had given everyone permission to breathe again. A soft exhale went through the crowd. Then, the applause began. It didn't start with a few claps. It rose as one, a wave of sound that was completely different from the polite, patter-like applause that had followed the other performers. This was deep, sustained, and thunderous. People rose to their feet. The former violinist was standing, clapping so hard her hands must have hurt. Her tear-streaked face now lit with a fierce joy. The society lady was on her feet, her earlier pity replaced by awe. The host stood, clapping. His earlier discomfort vanished in pure astonishment. It was a standing ovation, but it felt less like praise and more like a release. A necessary outburst of feeling after being held so still by the music. Alara flinched at the sound, as if the applause were a physical shock. She looked out at the sea of standing people, their faces transformed, and a deep blush spread from her neck to her hairline. This was the part she had never wanted, the seeing, the being seen. She had given the music, and that was private. This reaction was public, and it overwhelmed her. She made a small, instinctive move to stand up, to flee the bench. The maestro saw it. He understood in an instant. He raised his hands, not to the audience, but in a gentle, calming motion toward her. Asterisk, stay. It is yours. Asterisk. Then he turned to face the room. He did not ask for quiet. He simply held up one hand, palm out. The applause began to subside, slowing into a respectful, then a waiting silence. His authority was absolute now, but it was an authority he was using to protect her. He turned back to her. His voice was softer now, meant for her, though the room could hear every word. "That was not playing," he said. The room was so quiet they could hear the rustle of his sleeve as he gestured. "That was excavation. You were digging for something, and you found it." He paused, choosing his next words with immense care. "I have heard the hammer clavier adagio played by the greatest names of our time. I have played it myself." He let out a short breath that was almost a laugh of disbelief. "I have never heard it sound like that. It is always a monument for you." It was a memory. He was speaking to her, but he was also explaining it to himself, and to everyone listening. He was giving them the language for what they had felt but could not name. The control. The asterisk patience asterisk. He continued, his eyes drifting to her hands, which were now clutching each other tightly in her lap. You did not fight the silence. You let it speak. That is the first and final lesson. And you, he shook his head, you have known it for a long, long time, he asked, his tone shifting to one of pure, professional curiosity. Who was your teacher? Elara's voice, when it finally came, was hoarse, a dry whisper that the room strained to hear. Herr Professor, she said a name from a past era, a legendary and famously brutal instructor at the conservatory, known for breaking as many spirits as he made careers. He had died decades ago. A murmur rippled through the older members of the audience. The Maestro's eyes widened. He was a tyrant, the Maestro stated, not as criticism, but as fact. A ghost of a smile touched Elara's lips, there and gone. Yes, and he taught you. And then, the Maestro's question hung there. Asterisk, what happened next? Where is the career, the fame, the records? Asterisk, this was the moment the story began to leak into the room. Not in a flood, but in droplets. Elara looked down at her hands, at the scar, at the calluses that spoke of other work. There was an illness in my family, my studies. Ended, she said it so simply. Asterisk ended. Asterisk not paused, not postponed. Ended, like a door closing. There were responsibilities, she did not say. A sick mother, a father gone, younger siblings to raise. She did not say. Piano lessons traded for secretarial work. Concert halls traded for quiet rooms in other people's houses. She did not say. A lifetime of playing only when the world was asleep. Keeping the music alive like a whispered secret. Because it was the one part of herself the world could not take and use up. She just said responsibilities, and in that word, the people in the room, especially the older ones, heard the whole story of a life lived for others. The Maestro closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, they were bright. He nodded, not in pity, but in a profound, sad understanding. He saw not a tragedy, but a choice. He saw the artist who had chosen a different kind of fidelity. So you kept it for yourself, he said. Not a question. She nodded, just once. The applause started again then. Softer this time. Not a roar, but a warm, sustained murmur of respect. It was for the music, but also for the woman, for the hidden life, for the quiet sacrifice they could all suddenly see, written in the lines of her face and the depth of her music. The Maestro did something then that no one expected. He extended his hand to her, not to shake, but to help her rise from the bench. It was a gesture of pure, old-world chivalry. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her hand in his. He felt the strength in those fingers, the same strength that had commanded the keyboard. He helped her stand, together. They turned to face the room, the modest woman and the great Maestro, side by side. And for that moment, in the eyes of everyone present, there was no difference in stature between them at all. The room did not return to what it was before. Something had been cracked open, and there was no sealing it back up. The polite, glittering shell of the evening was gone. What remained was something warmer, more human, and humble. As the soft applause faded, people didn't rush for the drinks. They lingered, speaking in hushed tones, but their conversations were different now. They weren't about summer houses or the orchestra's second violins. They were about the music. They were about her. Did you hear the control in the left hand? I've never felt so seen by a piece of music. That name, her teacher. My goodness, he was a monster. To have survived that. Elara stood beside the piano, the Maestro's hand still lightly under her elbow, as if he was steadying a precious, fragile object. She looked overwhelmed, her eyes darting toward the door, toward the safety of the large armchair in the corner. Frau Heger appeared then, her face glowing with a pride that was fierce and maternal. She slipped an arm around Elara's shoulders. You see? Frau Heger said softly, her voice thick. You see? They needed to hear you. Elara gave her a look that was both grateful and slightly reproachful, but she leaned into the embrace. The Maestro released Elara's arm but did not move away. He was a lighthouse, and everyone now wanted to approach, but his presence created a respectful circle around the two women. He was, for the moment, her protector. The first to break the circle was the former violinist from the back row. She approached, her steps tentative. She didn't speak to the Maestro. She went straight to Elara, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. Thank you, the woman said, her voice cracking. She reached out and took both of Elara's hands in her own. I put my violin away 20 years ago, after my children were born. I told myself it was just for a while, and then, it was just easier to leave it in the case. She squeezed Elara's hands, feeling the calluses that were not so different from the ones she used to have. You played what it feels like to have a voice, and to choose to use it only for yourself. It is not a small thing." She didn't wait for a reply, just nodded, her lips pressed tightly together, and moved away, as if she had said what she needed to survive the evening. This opened the floodgate, not of a crowd, but of a few, sincere individuals. The young pianist who had played Rachmaninoff came up, his bravado completely stripped away. He bowed his head slightly. "Ma'am," he said, using the same respectful title as the maestro had, "your trills, they were perfect. But it was the silence after the main theme that I will remember. I have never understood how to use silence." He looked like he wanted to ask 100 questions, but he just bowed again and stepped back. A stooped, elderly gentleman with thick glasses shuffled forward. He had said nothing all night. He peered at Alara. "You studied with him asterisk," he rasped. "He threw a metronome at my head in 1957. Broke my glasses." A faint smile appeared on his face. He only threw things at the ones he believed had something worth breaking out of them. "He must have seen something extraordinary in you." He gave a slow, approving nod and turned away. Alara received these comments with a quiet, slightly dazed grace. She murmured "thank you" over and over, but it was clear she was not used to being the center of this kind of attention. Her eyes kept seeking the exit. The maestro observed all this. He saw how each person brought a piece of the puzzle. The brutal teacher, the sacrificed career, the private, enduring practice. He saw not a ruined prodigy, but a fulfilled artist of a different kind. Her concert hall had been the empty sunroom. Her audience had been the dust in the sunbeams and her own honest heart. It was a purer form of art, in a way, uncorrupted by fame or money or criticism. The host finally approached, wringing his hands, but now with admiration, not anxiety. "My dear lady, you have gifted us an unforgettable evening. Truly, the highlight of our season." He looked at the maestro, seeking guidance. "Perhaps some refreshment? Champagne?" The maestro shook his head. He could see the exhaustion settling into Alara's frame. The immense emotional expenditure of the performance was now giving way to a deep weariness. "I think," the maestro said, his voice once again the kindest sound in the room, "that perhaps we have asked enough of our artist for one night." He turned to Alara. "Would you allow me the honor of seeing you to your car?" It was a dismissal of the room, and a shield for her. The message was clear. The performance was over. The artist needed rest. A path cleared for them as they moved toward the grand hallway, Frau Heger on one side, the maestro on the other, Alara between them like a rare manuscript being escorted back to its vault. Soft, respectful smiles followed them, but no one else approached. In the spacious, marble-floored foyer, away from the crowd, the maestro paused. The sounds of the salon were muffled here. A maid was fetching their coats. He turned to Alara. The performance all was still in his eyes, but it had softened into something more thoughtful. "May I ask one more impertinent question?" he said. Alara looked up at him, waiting. "Do you play every day?" She nodded. "Yes, in the sunroom. In the morning, before the house is awake." He smiled, a real, warm smile that transformed his severe face. "Of course. The light is best then." He understood completely. "And are you happy with that? With that being enough?" She considered this. It was the most important question anyone had asked her all night. She thought of the silent house, the first touch of sun on the keys, the music that existed only for her and the walls. "It is my piece," she said simply. "It has always been enough." The maestro's smile deepened. He saw no regret in her. He saw a life that had integrated its art into its fabric, not built its life around the art. It was a subtle, profound difference. "Then," he said, his voice full of a new respect, "you have succeeded where most of us fail. We search for applause to tell us we are good. You already knew." He accepted his coat from the maid but did not put it on. "The world is loud, madam. What you have protected in that sunroom, it is a quiet miracle. Thank you for letting us hear its echo tonight." Frau Heger's car pulled up under the portico. The driver held the door open. The maestro, in a final gesture, did not bow or offer his hand to shake. Instead, he placed a hand briefly over his heart and gave a small, solemn nod. It was the acknowledgement of one artist to another, of equal to equal. No greater compliment could be paid. Alara, touched, mirrored the gesture, her hand fluttering to her own chest for a moment. Then, with Frau Heger's gentle guidance, she slipped into the dark interior of the car. As the car pulled away, the maestro stood on the steps, watching it go. The host came out, joining him. "An astonishing night, maestro. Who would have thought?" The maestro did not take his eyes off the retreating taillights. "We look for talent in the wrong places," he said quietly, almost to himself. "We look on stages. We look in conservatories. We should look in sunrooms. We should look in quiet corners." He finally turned to go back inside. A changed man in a subtly fundamental way. The true maestro tonight was not in the audience. She was the one we almost sent away without hearing. Back in the car, the city lights streaked by the windows. Frau Heger was buzzing with excitement, talking about the reactions, the faces. Elara listened, giving small smiles, but she was quiet. She leaned her head against the cool glass. She wasn't thinking about the applause or the maestro's profound words. She was thinking about the morning. She was thinking about the old upright piano in the sunroom, waiting for her. She thought about the way the first light of day would fall across its keys, and the deep, private silence that would surround her before she played the first note. The recital had been a strange, beautiful dream, but her real music, the music that was truly hers, wasn't for salons or maestros. It was for that quiet room, and for her alone. And tomorrow morning, as she did every morning, she would go back to it, not as an overlooked woman, but as the complete artist she had always been, finally seen, and yet, happily, returning to the peace of being unseen. The melody was over, but the music, her music, had never stopped.